Welcome to the Biblical Worldview Show, a ministry of RenewaNation. On today's episode, I'm joined by Dr. Josh Mulvihill, the director of the Church and Family Division at RenewaNation and the author of this book, a phenomenal book on biblical worldview. In today's episode, we're going to take a deep dive into worldview formation and talk about what factors and people shape our worldview. Join me and Dr. Josh Mulvihill as we look at life through the lens of Scripture. Well, welcome to this episode of the Biblical Worldview Show, where we are looking at who develops or what develops the biblical worldview of a child. And man, we have an amazing guest who is back on the show, Dr. Josh Mulvihill, the director of Church and Family at RenewaNation. And really, Josh is a phenomenal author, and he is the author of this book, Biblical Worldview. We'll get a close-up up there. We'll probably drop a graphic in. But Biblical Worldview, what it is, why it matters, and how to shape the worldview of the next generation. Dr. Mulvihill, thank you for being with us again.
Hey, Ben, it's good to be back, and hello to everybody else.
So you are fresh off of an important, and Josh, among Dr. Mulvihill, among many things, is he has a lot of influence in our nation, and I'm really grateful for the guests that we have, because most of them do. And one of the things is, are we allowed to say that you are a board member of Awana, correct?
Sure, yeah.
I don't know if that's secret.
No, it's not at all.
But you were
just got back from our board meeting. And of course, 3 days of board meetings says lots of fun, but
you were in Boca Raton when it's like freezing up in Minneapolis area. So there is that.
Yeah, it was wonderful. You live in a great state, Ben.
Well, Minnesota's great some of the year.
Absolutely.
It's a beautiful state, especially if you like cold. It is awesome. But no, Minnesota's. So I wanted to get to this, but before we do, this once again is a phenomenal book. We're going to dig into one of the chapters about developing a worldview. But another book I do want to recommend to you that Josh wrote, it's called 50 Things, or specifically, what's the full title of 50 Things, Josh?
Yeah, it's 50 Things Every Child Needs to Know Before Leaving Home. So it's helping children grow up to become godly, mature adults. How to do that.
In my opinion, for practical steps of biblical worldview shaping, I believe this book is the gold standard. And understand about book publishing, it is not like it used to be. So back in the day, you'd sell if you wrote a bunch of books, they sold. Now, if you can sell 500 to 1,000 copies, a publisher will tell you you are doing a phenomenal job with your book. And it's my understanding, Josh, have you? I think I know what the number is. Or last week, how many copies of 50 Things have sold? I know it's over 1,000.
Yeah, you're right, though. Book sales aren't like they used to be, but this one's averaging, I think, about 10,000 a year on a high year, on a low year, about 5,000. So we're, it's just, we talk about a plan to disciple your children, and, we get Deuteronomy 6, talk about these things, like what does that actually look like? Yeah. On a daily basis with a 2-year-old or an 8-year-old or a 15-year-old. And this is kind of the Deuteronomy 6 in action, intentional parenting, kind of holistic. We talk about discipleship in the church, kind of on your spiritual habits and your pietism, and your moralistic stuff. but it's so much broader scripturally than that. So this kind of hits the full spectrum.
The book is extremely practical, and that's what I like about it. It just gives you a roadmap as to what to do as a parent. I have 6 copies, I think, in my closet, and I just give them away from time to time and replace them. But it's just a phenomenal book, so if you haven't checked that out. But we do want to look at biblical worldview, what it is, why it matters, and how to shape the worldview of the next generation. Specifically, we're looking at the chapter on who develops a child or a person's worldview. And so I wanted to start there, and my first question is, why is let me get to, I'm sorry, I cannot see my notes through the microphone. I'm like trying to see them here. So let me hold them up here. Okay. So in your book, Biblical Worldview, what it is, why it matters, and how to shape the worldview of the next generation, you have an entire chapter dedicated to the question, who shapes a child's worldview? So you start the chapter out with a Barna research study that asks kids who the major influencers were in their lives. And this, I was reading this, preparing for this. This is a fascinating study. Can you talk about this a little bit?
So Barna asked teenagers, these are like 17-year-olds, and who up to this point in your life, this isn't like a 5-year-old child, this is who has made you who you are today, the main, looking back, the main influences. He found 5. I'm betting we can all guess who the number 1 influence is. It's parents, and that is the case, across the board almost everywhere. The only reason parents wouldn't be the primary influence is because that void has been filled by somebody else, because they haven't had the kind of influence that we all desire. 2 was, who do you guess is number 2? Drum roll. Number 2 was actually other family members, typically a grandparent. And we could talk about why that is in a little bit. Number 3 was coaches and teachers. Number 4 was peers. And then number 5 was the church, generally pastors. And as you kind of think through those 5, they follow a pretty simple logic in my view. It's simply who spends the most time with a child over the course of a child's life. And so that's why grandparents are so high, because who else has that kind of presence in a young person's life from birth to adulthood? This doesn't minimize the church or even education. We have a lot of influence with young people, but I was a youth pastor for about a decade. I would get them for a couple years and then they'd move on. Or a teacher will get a child for a year and have a lot of time during that time, but it's localized. And so, we could make a lot of applications from that, but that's real helpful, I think, in thinking through the who in the shaping of young people. In that study, it didn't mention media. Of course, that's a huge one today. And that's primarily because it wasn't an in-flesh influence. These people are influencing through the screens, but they would be. That's a different topic for a different day.
So why is the home so important when we talk about time? Like why is the home vital here?
God designed parents as the primary influencer. We could even say that family is God's method of discipleship, of biblical worldview formation. And, nobody gets the kind of time with a child that parents have. And what I've generally seen, we think a lot about we want all the, give me the secret tips and give me the practical stuff. But with parents, what ends up happening is children tend to gravitate towards what parents are passionate about. Whatever the priority is in life, children oftentimes will, go that route. And so this is why when we see, think about what you love as a parent, my guess is your kids in some capacity love that as well. My dad loved fishing, so do I. My dad loves the Vikings, so do I. Even more than that, my parents love Jesus. And it translated into their daily living. And because of that time piece, you just, you absorb those values and those views just through the day. And so that's, nothing comes close to mom and dad. A lot of times I think we make the assumption, oh, I'm not discipling my children. And that might be true from an intentionality standpoint, formal, sit down, go through something systematically. But it isn't true in that we all disciple our children every day through the small and the large interactions that we have with them. We're giving them a morality through our daily decisions. We're showing them wisdom based on our choices. We're, all of that is shaping our children's worldview as just kind of as we walk through. And there's nothing even a close second to that.
I may be jumping ahead, but it's a logical flow to the conversation, Josh, so I apologize. But one of the things that you mention in this chapter is the consistency or the connection between a child embracing their faith into adulthood and leaving their faith, that the biggest factor is hypocrisy with the parents. I grew up in a pastor's home, and I got the stereotypical, you're a preacher's kid, you're going to be a rebel rouser and a rebellious person and all of this. And, but that, thankfully, by the grace of God, I hopefully I follow his word. And so I wouldn't be one of those statistics. I'm grateful for that. But as I look at even pastors' kids, I feel like the ones that embrace it, that continue to embrace their parents, the most consistent factor is that the dad was the way he was in the pulpit, in the church, and he was at home. And that was true of my father. And you make that statement about parents across the board, not just pastors. Could you talk about how important, I feel like that factors into the idea that, yes, we need to systematically teach our kids, but I'm teaching my children how to be a good father when I'm kind to their mother. I'm teaching them how to interact with people when I may disagree with something that happened in the home, but how am I going to handle that? And I'm doing all this teaching. I didn't sit anybody down and say, hey, learn this. And I think but I don't know if you want to dig into that a little bit more, but that's just so well said.
Yeah, I'll just say you're right on. Authenticity is absolutely critical that our kids see. The kinds of things that we say are important to us literally that's what we're living by. There's a realism there. And that, that doesn't mean we don't do the formal, planned out, systematic kind of stuff, but that can't take the place for if our kids see there's not congruency between our walk and our talk, the formal stuff just doesn't stand a chance. It's not going to replace. And so it's a both and. And your parents were, you were blessed to have that. But I will say that also should be encouraging to us in that makes up for some shortcomings that all of us have as parents. We all think, oh my goodness, we've got a lot going on. What God's asked of us as parents, it's a lot. Like, wow, I don't, can I measure up? Am I going to be able to do this? If our heart is on passion, is burning for the Lord, a child sees that. And, when we fall short and we can confess our sins to our kids, or we don't get to do that planned out formal thing like we would like, we can know that as we go, the as you go kind of stuff is still happening. And that's, I think that's an encouragement to all parents.
Well, doesn't, you in your book, you say it takes a family to develop a biblical worldview, but I thought it takes a village, right? Like, isn't that what Hillary Clinton said?
Hillary, good Hillary. Well, I've seen The Village, and I don't want them raising my kids. Don't take this to the extreme where you think, that it just means as a family we kind of hole up and isolate, and it's only mom and dad. We do need other godly individuals. That this study shows that. But what's happened, I think, on the other end is we've given too much of our responsibility that God's given us as parents away to others, outsource that at the expense of our kids. And there's, in the children's youth ministry world, there is this kind of subtle idea that, yeah, it's a parent's job, but, we've got a role too. And Ben, I just want to read you a quote. This is from the president of one of the largest children's ministry resourcers in the country. They have one of the largest children's ministry conferences right now. 2,000, 3,000 pastors will come every year. And this is the kind of thing that's being said in that arena. So this is what
Okay, that is a great buildup. We are going to take a break. And when we come back, you are going to hear this amazing quote from Dr. Mulvihill and more from how a child's worldview is shaped when we come back. One of the things we wanted to do on the Biblical Worldview show was not only give you great content and equip you with truth, but also expose you to resources that could help you as a parent, as a pastor, as a leader, or as an individual develop a biblical worldview. 50 Things Every Child Needs to Know Before Leaving Home by Dr. Josh Mulvihill. And I want to tell you about this book because I actually believe it is one of the greatest parenting books ever written, and I'm that's not an oversell. The reason why 50 Things is so powerful is because not only does it help you equip your children with the biblical worldview, it allows you to do so with intentionality by focusing on 50 different things. This actually comes from a story that actually happened to the author. When he was 18 years old, he went with his parents to lunch. And they pulled out this old crumpled piece of paper. They slid it across the lunch table. And they said, Josh, when we brought you home from the hospital, we determined as parents that there were 50 things we wanted to make sure that you knew that we taught you by the age of 18. Today's your 18th birthday. How'd we do? And they gave him the actual list that they wrote. That intentionality allowed his parents to have goals regarding information. This book was based on that principle that you as a parent, starting from a young child all the way up, could have 50 things that you focus on to help equip your child with the biblical worldview. I challenge you, if you're a parent, drop everything and get this book. If you're a grandparent, buy this for your children so that your grandchildren can be equipped. I have numerous copies. I give this book out all the time as a gift. A great resource, 50 Things Every Child Needs to Know Before Leaving Home by Dr. Josh Mulvihill. And we are back with the Biblical Worldview Show, a ministry of RenewaNation, and we have RenewaNation's own church and family. I always want to say faith and family. I don't know why, because it's definitely church and family. The director of church and family, Dr. Josh Mulvihill, and was about to bust out a quote. And we are ready, Josh. Go ahead, Dr. Mulvihill.
Okay, yeah, this is what she says. This is on Deuteronomy 6. She says, the main point of Deuteronomy 6 was that all of God's people are responsible for telling all of the children all about God. Then she continues, Deuteronomy 6 was not spoken to an individual family unit. It was spoken to the family of God. It was spoken to the nation of Israel as a collective mandate. So, she's getting that from it. It starts out, Hear, O Israel. So, it's to the entire nation of Israel, which it is, but I'll respond in a second. It is not singularly the parents' responsibility, although they have a significant role to play. So this is the mindset, the common mindset in the children's and youth ministry arena. Now, of course, I will disagree strongly with what she asserts there. It is the parent's individual responsibility, and to say that blatantly disregards Deuteronomy 6 itself. Teach these things to whose children? Your children, not our children. And where do you teach them? In your home, not somebody else's home. So, there is a role that the church, if you want to call it the village, community has, but it is not a parent's role. It is different. It is supportive at best. And we need to make sure that as parents, we are doing what God has called us to. And there's no substitute. There's fallback options. The grandparents are God's emergency plan, which we could talk about here next. And the church is the ultimate emergency plan, but they can't step in totality.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Just for sake of time, I'd love to echo that, but just for sake of time, you found well said though, you found another study that discovered the majority of parents do not spend, and this blew me away, not a low amount of time, any time during a typical week discussing religious matters or studying the Bible. In some ways, I'm shocked by this. But in other ways, you look at our culture and you go, well, that kind of starts to make sense. Like the pieces start fitting together. Could you talk a little bit more about that study and this problem?
If you start to ask parents, what are you doing to disciple your children? You'll see that this is a reality. That's what I did as a pastor. So I met individually with every single family in our church that had a teenager. And I said, hey, I'm pastor at the church. I was brand new to the church. So I played the I want to get to know you card. And in that, tell me what you're doing to disciple your children. And of those 60 families, it was a small percentage. Some were doing a great job, but they were clearly the outlier. The majority were relying on the church. And after meeting with 60 families, I realized, oh my goodness, we have a crisis here. These children are not being discipled in any consistent, regular basis in the home. And if that's you, we don't say that to cause guilt or to create shame. I hope you don't hear that at all coming through any of this.
Amen.
We're trying to awaken and encourage. Children do not develop a biblical worldview through osmosis, and they are always shaping their worldview, especially in the early years. And so if we're not doing that intentionally, consistently, aggressively, we know 100% the world is. They are aggressively in the worldview shaping business. And so the only way they succeed in that is that we aren't, is that we're not, our voice isn't the first and the loudest. And so every parent in here we have to win at home. We have to make sure we get it done with our own children, because if we don't, nobody else will. I've given my life for 20 years as a pastor to help other people's kids develop a biblical worldview. And I got to the point of realizing, I can do some, but I can't pick up the slack for parents that don't. So anyways, this isn't a guilt-inducing thing, but it is all right, parents, it is time to step up to the plate and get really, really serious about developing a child's biblical worldview.
So well said. There's so many little tangents that I could jump off of, but I do think that sometimes to protect the either poor performance of a parent that resulted in a bad result, or possibly, I do think it's possible that a parent could get things right and their child make a wrong decision. I do think that's possible. I mean, I think children can make their own decision. I think to protect the feelings of that, we have kind of almost sidelined the importance of, hey, if you don't get this right, there will be consequences that are dire to your child. And of course, there's grace there. The point isn't to bash. The point is to warn. And I appreciate you saying that. We've already talked about this, but the study of the 5,000 atheists, and the primary reason that they were atheists was inconsistency in the home. And we kind of talked about that a little bit. So I want to talk about this because we're talking about parents getting it right. You talk about outsourcing spiritual development. And if you're familiar with this in a business context, a lot of companies will go overseas to outsource part of their business. And what we're saying is in the same way, well, explain what you mean by that, I guess would be, let me throw it to you.
Discipleship can't be outsourced at the end of the day. That is God's good design, is for the home to shape a child's love, life, how their views and their values. And when we don't do that, problems ensue, and we can't, we've got a procedural problem when we ask a pastor or a teacher to do that for us. And I think that we've tried that honestly for a couple generations. We've said, we're gonna let others try to be that primary influence, and I'm not gonna put it all on the results that we see today on the shoulders of individuals. But I do think we are seeing some of the issues we have today with where people are in their faith, not because the church or Christian schools have done a poor job, but because we've asked the church or the school to do what God has asked the family to do.
Yeah.
That's it at the end of the day.
Yeah. Oh, that's, so well said. I also feel like some of this is a church problem too, where there is a philosophy, and you mentioned it before, where I don't know if it's arrogance or responsibility, but it's my job as a youth pastor. And really, I see the job as a youth pastor and the pastor to be equipping the parents to do their job. Yep. And of course, there should be some supplemental things. But what about schooling? Because that is especially in Western world, we spend so much of our lives in school. Is that relevant to worldview shaping? I think I have a guess as to what Josh is going to say.
Yeah, so the number 3 influence on that list was educators. And, we talk a lot about that on this podcast, so we don't have to hit it too much. But I will just say kids get 16,000 hours on average, kindergarten through 12th grade. On the topic of education, let's not make the conversation about public versus private or Christian versus homeschool. Ultimately, it's the philosophy behind education that's most important. And behind every form of education there's only 2 options. Is it secular or is it biblical? And, so you could choose any version of education and it has a secular foundation, and it's going to be problematic. Because it's, what secular education does is it replaces God with man. Man becomes the center of education. And of course, when man becomes the center, God never created the world to operate with man as center. And so a lot of our kids their views and values are being shaped by an educational philosophy that doesn't align with the truth that's taught in God's word. And so in America, we've kind of bought this idea that education is other. It lives outside of church family. And in the Bible, it's not its own institution. Right. So if I were to ask, where does education fit scripturally? God's only created 3 institutions: church, family, and government. There is no 4th institution of education. That means it's one of those 3 areas of responsibility. Currently, the one taking responsibility for that primarily is the government. And of course, when we have a jurisdictional violation, someone taking responsibility for someone else's area, which this is happening with education, you have chaos. You don't have flourishing that occurs. And so, we just need to be mindful. The only thing, I guess I'll finish with this on education. If we're teaching things that don't align with the real world, with God's truth, that separates out areas and says they're other, we can't develop a biblical worldview in those areas. It's just plain and simple. So, there's a lot of applications about, man, we could have a lot of conversations, but I will just say, as parents, if this is a new concept to you, let it plant some seeds and do some exploration. A really good book to consider is Kingdom Education by Glenn Schultz. That'll begin to help you think through, how do I think through education in a way that helps me develop the biblical worldview of my children. That's a great starting point. RenewaNation has many resources. Ben with Center for Truth and Love has a lot of great resources. So check out those kinds of resources. They help you kind of understand education from the Bible and how that shapes a child.
Absolutely. Let me check on our time. How are we doing? We're about 12 minutes. Okay. Well, we have more coming with Dr. Josh Mulvihill, but unfortunately for this episode, our time is done. We're going to hold him over for a part 2 on shaping worldview. And in our part 2, I really want to get to some things. And Dr. Mulvihill, I hope you're okay with this, to even talk about, so I'm an adult, how do I shape my worldview? What are some things I need to be thinking about to help? Because you cannot give what you do not have. And I've got to say, I love the partnership that I get to be in with RenewaNation, because I get to be around men like Jeff Keaton and Dr. Josh Mulvihill and Glenn Schultz, who also is a part of RenewaNation. I'm just so grateful for what you're doing. So hopefully this episode has been helpful to you as a parent to think about some of these things that are shaping the next generation. And then definitely tune into part 2 of this discussion, where we talk about even shaping our own worldview. Remember, you can go to RenewaNation.org and get this book from Dr. Mulvihill, the one we were discussing today, Biblical Worldview. Also his 50 Things book. He has books on grandparenting, which we will bring up a little bit in our next episode. Thanks so much for watching the Biblical Worldview Show.